Hi, so recently I put out this short that's just me kind of playing around with the different options in the rigid body constraints. So how did I set it up here? I'm using a couple of the add-ons and features. Here I'm using this tab for Pi menu and material library, and then also the mesh extra objects in this tutorial. So I moved the cube, the default cube up one, and then I want to relocate the origin. So here I'm using the origin to 3D cursor, but I'm using a shortcut. You can see I'm using the Q menu, and there you can put your favorites in the menu, and if you hit Q you can hit those favorites. And then I copied it, moved it over on the x-axis, shrank it down, and then here I'm putting a gear there, and I'm going to hook it up to a worm gear, so I want to adjust the skewness up, and eventually I'm going to hook up some rigid body constraints on this, but first I want to give it a little bit of extra geometry, and then I want to close up this inner radius here. And here again, I'm using the Q menu to make a shortcut for this bridge loops. And then I gave it a subdivision. And then I'm moving over to the other cube and setting the cursor to that object. And then I'm placing a gear, and this time it's a worm gear. And I'm going to go shift that up and then take that in the cube and move it over, and then make some minor adjustments to that object and the and the other gear in order for them to kind of match up. So here I'm setting one of the gears to inactive, and then I'm going down the object menu to rigid body, add active. There's two different ways to actually add rigid body constraints to. There's two different ways to add rigid body attributes to an object, and so I'm showing you two different ways for both two active objects that are the gears and the two passive objects that are the cubes. And then I'm setting the collisions to mesh for both of those, and then reducing the margin down to 0 to kind of prevent them from flying apart or locking up. And then I'm creating a connection between the first cube and the gear, and that's going to be a hinge, and doing the same for the other, and the hinge is acting the z-axis. So it's connect and make it a hinge. And then between the first cube and the gear, I'm also adding a motor constraint, and that acts along the x-axis, so I want to rotate that constraint until the x is in the axial direction there. So there we go, and then I need to turn on the angular motion there and give it a velocity and a maximum impulse, and then that should interact with the worm gear and translate the motion over to the worm gear. And then the top of the worm gear, I'm going to go ahead and fill that, and then I'm going to add some extra geometry here in order to have a lever that kind of rotates around with it and then interacts with the next rigid object. So I put a cylinder in there, and that's going to be like a little spindle that's out to a larger portion that's actually the base of the lever, and then some of those panels I'm going to go ahead and extrude those, and that's going to be the lever, and I'm going to add some extra geometry to that. So there we go. And then if I go back to object mode and turn this on, you can see it's kind of spinning around like that. It's going the opposite direction from what I intended, so I need to go over and change the motor constraint, kind of flip the angular velocity there, and there you go. It's going the right way now. So I'm going to go ahead and add a cube and move it over. And here I'm going to make a slider. And I have another video out there where I go into some of these rigid constraints and explain them in a little more detail. Here I'm focusing on application. So I have a panel here, and that's actually going to be the object that's on the slider. And then I need another object for it to be attached to that's going to be a passive rigid object. So I'm going to copy it, and then I'll shrink it down, and then I'm going to go ahead and make that a passive object, and then the other object an active object, and then I'm going to add a connection between the two, and that's going to be a slider. And here you see I changed that to slider, and the slider acts in the X direction, so I'm going to reorient that axis for the constraint so that X is in the direction that I want it to slide. Rigid body for that, for some reason I didn't do that. I thought I did, but it's active. And this one is passive, okay. I'm just checking what I set up for the two objects, and now it goes. There you go. And this one I kind of want to just not see that right now. And you'll see it a little later in the video where that's actually a mistake that I made that I had to fix, because I needed to move that out of the way of the other object that I'm creating right here, which is going to be a little like foot that kind of is hinged and kind of rotates down to hit a ball that's going to go down a slide. So I put the cursor there, and then make an icosphere, and that's going to be the hinge point. And I create another object out of that icosphere. And if I hit the P key, I'm going to separate that as an extra object, as its own object, I mean. And then that's going to be the passive object, and this lever and icosphere is going to be the object that's hinged to it. So you see I'm making this passive object and the other an active object. And then I'm going to set up the connection between them. There you go, connect. And this is going to be a hinge. And for some reason I put the hinge over at, put the hinge over at the center of the foot there. And so I need to move that over to where my cursor is, right there. That's the hinge. And then I need to rotate it so that Z is along the hinge line that I intend. So you see it slides, and it moves down a little bit. And what I did is I hid the the passive object that's associated with the slider. So this is actually hitting that and coming to a stop. And I was messing around with it, and eventually I remembered that I did that. And once I took care of that, things worked out. And so here I am setting up that constraint again. I did this several times before I actually realized what I did. And I move it over and then rotate it so that Z is along the hinge line. So now it slides. And there I need to rotate that so that Z is along the hinge line. And then when I restart it, there we go. Well, now it's hitting. This is where I realized I was hitting the object that I hid before. Moves out of the way, and then that leg with the foot kind of moves down. And that's eventually going to hit a sphere, and it's going to roll down a section of track. So now I made a sphere, and then I used a cylinder to kind of make a track. I added some solidify to it, and then adjusted that until I made a circular, half circular section. And I used the simple deform in order to do that. I had to move down one end of it, and then I used an array to kind of make a second section, and I had to kind of play around with the adjustment until they almost matched. And there you go. So then I added some cubes in there and some other geometry in order to make it look like the gears were actually attached to something. Here I added a cylinder, and that's just going to be an object that I just give a material, and it's going to be sitting there at the center. See, I added some, it's like a little wind chime where I added some spheres and on the top part of some cylinders, and then I make them all passive rigid bodies, the spheres, and then the cylinders are active bodies. And then here I'm giving it a point rigid body constraint between the cylinder and the spheres. So those kind of act like pinned constraints. It's like a little universal joint. And I noticed that when I tried to use the cylinder object for the shape for collisions, it actually wants that to be about the center of mass, so I had to change the center of mass of those cylinders, change the origin to the center of mass, to those cylinders, and then it seemed to behave as I kind of expected it to. And then basically that's it. After that, I added some lights, gave it a background scene. This is the interior environment that's part of Blender. And then I added materials, and the materials I all grabbed from the add-on that I pointed to at the beginning. There's galvanized steel, there's wood, there's plastics, and so I gave those to the various objects that I put into the scene. And that's basically it. And here's a view of the whole thing. I changed some of the colors on the plastic that I used for the metal material that I used for the little track for the ball. And then I played around with some of the materials a little bit to get something that I liked, and that's basically it. So if you liked the video, hit like or subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Thanks.